Tune into this week's on .net, where I have my good friend Brice on, who's going to demystify Entity Framework Core migrations. So tune in. Hey everyone, I'm James Montemagno, and I'm back with another on .net episode. This time, probably one of my favorite topics of all time because I know nothing about it, which is all about database migrations with Entity Framework Core. And I brought none other than my best friend in the entire world, Brice Lambson, on. How's it going, Brice?
Howdy, it's surreal being here. I remember when the show premiered in like 2016. I've been a fan ever since. So I'm honored to be on.
I'm super excited because, everyone on the EF Core team is just like, you got to have Brice on. You got to have Brice on, because I'm like, I don't know anything about anything. So you're on the EF Core team, correct?
Yes.
Yes. And how long have you been on the EF Core team, and what all do you do there?
Oh man, I've been on there almost 12 years now, and I'm working on migrations almost since the beginning. And I work on reverse engineering. I work on a lot of SQLite stuff. Those are the things I remember right now.
So what would you say, if people are just turning in, they're like, oh man, database migrations, I love that. Like, what is the pitch for EF Core in general? Like, why are people using EF Core, and why is it so important?
Yeah, EF Core is just one of many options. Like database migrations have been around, specifically database schema migrations. I know the word migrations is very overloaded. We're talking here about your database schema, which is all the tables, the columns, the foreign keys, all that database stuff. And schema migrations is a pattern for really evolving that schema as your application evolves, as the requirements change. You can think of it a lot as sort of like version control, which is for your source code. Like you record what changes you make to your source code so you can share those with other developers. Schema migrations are sort of the steps to evolve your schema as your application evolves. They definitely weren't invented by EF. They existed long before. If you've ever used Ruby, Active Record had migrations before us. Even way back in the day, I remember like manually writing little tiny bits of SQL and like checking them into a repository. So, I mean, that's the pattern, right? Like it's recording the changes to the schema.
So I have a database, I have a person, for example, and I have like a first name, last name, and I deploy that application. And then I'm like, oh, I forgot to add a middle name. Like, is that the scenario that I need a migration, or is it a scenario where I'm like, oh, actually, I put it as a string, but it should really be an integer or something like that? Are those both examples that I just listed as migrations?
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's kind of two big use cases. One is for like everyday development, just like version control. Like I'm working on a feature, my teammate's working on a feature, and we're both evolving the database schema, and I don't want him to break me while I'm trying to work on my feature. And so it's just everyone kind of being on the same page in terms of their local database that they're testing with. And then you also mentioned like deployment. That's kind of like another thing. It was like, oh, we need to ship version 2 of our app. All the databases are still at version 1. How are we going to not delete all their data and yet update their database? So those are the two big scenarios.
Got it. Now, how come it just doesn't magically happen for free? Because I come from the mobile world where I use SQLite-net, and I'm just slanging Pogo Pogo objects like everywhere, adding stuff, removing stuff, and like it just kind of does it automatically, I think. Like, how come that just doesn't happen?
Yeah, Frank Krueger is a ninja. SQLite-net, it hides all this stuff from you. It's really good at additive changes. In fact, it's so good you don't even know it's doing it. You just hand it data and it says, oh, I need to put this data somewhere. I'm going to create a column for you. I'm going to create a table for you. So additive changes, you've probably never even encountered like those database schema. It works. It gets a little tricky when you want to like split the name column into a first name and a last name. That SQLite-net will then create 2 new columns, and the old one is just kind of there. And so, yeah, you kind of need to grow up into a migrations framework. And if you're using SQLite-net, there's a really great library called Fluent Migrator, I think is what they call it. And same with Dapper. Like you're not using EF, you probably don't want to use EF just for migrations, right? So there's another library that kind of encapsulates this pattern of recording the steps to your database. And you write it all in C# code, so you don't really need to know SQL. That's the real beauty of a migrations framework.
Got it. That's super cool. And I've been, getting, into the web world where EF Core seems like just the de facto as a .NET developer that I'm going to use. It's like built into templates or beautiful scaffolding. And I think the very first time I was going through an MS Learn module, I think the Cam wrote, it was like, oh, create this thing and run a migration. I was like, I have no idea what's happening right now. Like just I clicked a button and things happen. So I was hoping that you could kind of demystify that in a logical step. Like I'm brand new, which I am, by the way, to this. Like, what am I actually doing and what is happening? And how does the tooling kind of help me?
Yeah, before we get there, like as with any tool, you need to stop and ask yourself, like, is migrations even the right tool for me?
Mm,
Um, and so there's a lot of people who really love writing SQL. They like to craft their database by hand. They might have like a SQL Server project, and they add tables to it, and it's kind of the source of truth, as if you will, for the model. Like everything sort of flows from the database. You want to add something to the database, you go change the database, and then it kind of flows back into your application. And like the SQL Server project tools have a really cool thing called like schema diff, where you like model your table and then you say, okay, I want to make these changes to this database, and it will go out and make those changes. So if we like to call this a sort of a database first workflow on Entity Framework. If you love doing this, if this is how you work, migrations aren't for you.
oh, okay.
Continue writing your little SQL scripts or using the database project deploy tools. In fact, there's a really cool project called DB Up, which is associated with Octopus Deploy, but you can use it outside of that. And all it is a little console app that you add your SQL scripts to, and then it can just apply those to a database. So it takes care of like the tedious part of like running those one by one and making sure they run in order. So yeah, that's the tool if that's your workflow. Where migrations really shine is on the other end of the spectrum. You want your code to be the source of truth. You want to add a feature. The first place you think to go is go change my app code and change it there. And so we call this code first, although you don't have to start with the code first, but we like to call this code first because it's sort of the code is the source of truth, and then everything flows from there. Whether that's like you change your domain model in your application and then you go write a migration, or you have it generated for you in the case of EF. That's the flow there. So,
got it. That makes a lot of sense, where it's like, yeah, I see where you're coming from is like, hey, this database is controlling the scheme, and that is the source of truth, or the code, like you said, code first, database first, code first. This makes sense. The code, then that's what I'm used to, is like, here's my person class, here's the thing, and like database, please be what I want you to be, basically, instead of the vice versa, which is database, you are this, and my code will react to that. Did I summarize that correct?
Yeah, and if your database is the source of truth, we have something called reverse engineering or scaffolding. So you would make those changes to the database, and then you just re-scaffold your model, and it would bring in all those changes for you. So that's a tool for that. But if we want to look at what it looks like to use,
totally. Yeah, you want to bring up your monitor? We'll give it a look. Cool, I see it.
Alrighty, so here's my super simple application. It's just a console app. I'm not fancy. EF works anywhere you can imagine. It works in Maui.NET or .NET Maui projects. You want to write an Android app, an iOS app. We work on Blazor WebAssembly. If you want to write a little SQLite database on the client side of the browser, which is like mind-blowing to me, you can do that. As you mentioned, it's very popular with server-side applications. If you have a web API, a lot of times you go through EF, but just a console app today, just to keep things simple for this demo.
Okay.
So here I have a blog context, and this is sort of the entry point, EF's entry point into the database. And then on it, so right here is just an if statement. If I don't have any posts, add some sample ones just for the sake of having data in our database, and then go through every post in the database and just write them out.
Looks super duper simple. And that blog context, that is something that's important.
Yeah, let's have a look at that.
Okay.
I have it over here in my model. So it's just a class that inherits from DB context, and this is just Entity Framework magic. You don't really need to know what any of it does. And then in it, you have these things called DB sets, and these kind of map one-to-one to a table.
Okay.
So I have a post table.
Okay,
And
so
then,
so DB set is like a table, and then that table is going to have columns with different items in it, basically, of like what is a post. Is that correct?
yeah, and if you've ever heard the term like a unit of work, creating a new blog context is like saying I'm starting a unit of work. I'm going to make some changes to the database, or I'm going to get some stuff out of the database. And so you create a new one of these. If we go back to program, you create a new one of these, make the changes, and then sort of commit that unit of works, persist everything to the database.
Is that what we would call a transaction, basically, at that point? Like
Yeah, every time you call save changes there, this it wraps all these changes right here. It's adding 3 rows to the database
okay.
into a single transaction. So if it fails, you don't end up somewhere in the middle.
See, I know a little bit of the lingo, but yes, Frank has hidden most of it from me. So cool. Okay, I get it. Perfect.
All right, and then just in here, I'm using SQLite. EF Core works with all kinds of databases, PostgreSQL. We work with MySQL, SQL Server, obviously, Azure SQL, you name it. There's lots of providers. I like SQLite because it's simple.
Yeah.
Here I'm just writing to a file called blogs.db.
Cool.
And then here I have my plain old CLR object, my POCO, for my model, and this could flow all the way into your views if you were writing like a client side app. Here's a post. It has an ID. Lots of databases just use sort of surrogate primary keys, they call them, just to keep track of, because there's no such thing as like an instance, right? You can't just take an instance out of the database and shove it into C#. So this sort of identifies this piece of data. And it has a title and it has some content. Super simple.
Nice.
All right. So I've got my app written, my super cool app. I'm ready to run it. So let's see what that looks like.
And at this point, you haven't really done anything. You just wrote code, basically, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
This is all just plain old EF. Immediately, I hit an error.
Oh my goodness. It's
Oh,
but what's going on? Because I thought you are all about EF. You're on the EF team. How could this happen, Brice?
yeah. It says there's no such table posts. I don't have a database.
Oh.
I never created the database. So I wrote all my code. It went to query it and it threw because it couldn't find any data. I couldn't even find the database. So let's look at what it looks like to actually create the database. So the first step is to create a new migration. And for this, we use the NuGet package manager console.
Okay.
It's this little tool here. And this is kind of an odd little thing. You can think of it as like a console that knows more about Visual Studio. And you can actually use this to install packages. The first step when you want to get started, you need to install the tools. So we're going to install.
Bump that up for me on that little 100 down there?
Did it work?
Yeah, keep it going a little bit more.
There we go.
Perfect.
Ooh, it's really big. All right. I'm just going to use this to install the tools as a NuGet package. You could also right-click on your solution and manage NuGet packages. I just like to stay in the console here to get used to it, because you're going to see it here in a minute when we start using migrations.
All right. And I need this. So even though it's just kind of like initializing the database, I'm still creating a migration. Like it's an initial migration.
Yeah. So your very first migration is going to go from nothing to something. You're going to create the schema as it is right now in your app.
Got it. I think that was always my confusion because I'm like, I'm not really migrating anything, but that makes sense. You are migrating from you had nothing to this is the thing that you want in V1.
Yeah.
V0 to V1.
Yeah. So I'm gonna install this tools package. All it does is just add a package to my CS project here. Whoa, that's really big. Oh, I think those are linked together. All right, I'm not going to zoom out yet. So I'm going to keep working here in the console window. All right, now I have these tools installed, and they add a few commands. You don't have to use, this is sort of the Visual Studio way of doing it. There's another way if you're working in like Visual Studio, or sorry, outside of Visual Studio, and like Visual Studio for Mac or VS Code, or if you like Emacs or Vim or whatever, you can do all this stuff on the console. And the way you do that is just .NET tool install. I like to install it globally, so it's available everywhere. And it's just a tool called .NET EF.
Oh, cool.
And this is sort of the command line way if you're a console junkie and you like black and colorful text. And then it has kind of similar commands to what you're going to see in a minute. And you just invoke it with .NET EF. You get to see this cool little unicorn.
Ooh, I like that. ASCII. You can't be at ASCII art. I mean, come on.
For sure. For sure. I actually created that. I put it in as a joke, but the team let me keep it. So I was excited. And it has migrations commands. It has commands for working with the database or the DB context. Anyway, this is the command line way of doing it. I'm not going to show that because I like using Visual Studio and I like to stay in Visual Studio. And so there's PowerShell-y commands for the same thing. So right now we're going to add a migration. We're going to just call it initial create. Now this is sort of like a Git repository. I have like my first commit where I add all my code. I'm going to add all my schema as it is now so I can start evolving it.
And is that initial create, is that just a tag that you set, or is that actually a keyword that's of importance?
This is the name of the migration. You can think of it as like a commit message. And the way it comes out is it actually becomes sort of the class name here.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So if you were like adding, I'm not going to spoil it. You're going to do a bunch of cool stuff. I'm going to stop talking.
Yeah. And you can see over here, by default, it creates a migrations folder. And then you can see the initial create there. And it puts this big old timestamp in there. And the reason it uses the timestamp is to sort of help keep everything ordered correctly. Because at the end of the day, they're just files on the file system. But if you can see like the sequence of changes, and if your team's working on something else and you merge in their changes, you'll kind of see when they made their change.
Got it. That makes sense.
So let's look at the anatomy of a migration. You get this class. It has an up method and it has a down method. The up method is to sort of bring the database up to date with this migration, where your model was at in this migration. And it has this funny little DSL. Looks kind of like SQL, but it's very C# as well. So we're going to create a table. It's the post table. It has an ID, has a title, has content. It's got a primary key, that ID column. One thing here, though, the title here says that it's nullable true. And so that was kind of like a mistake. Like, oops, I'm not ready to share this with the team. So I'll show you in a minute. We're gonna get to that.
Okay.
Let me finish going through the anatomy.
Okay. Gotcha.
I'm getting ahead of myself. So excited. All right. And the down method, obviously, if you unapply this database, you go back to nothing. And so we drop the only table we created.
And a drop is like a deletion?
Yeah. It'll delete the table and all of its data from the schema in the database.
And these are just helper methods, like no one's calling this yet, or like these are methods that you could call. I guess like you could new up an initial create and then call those methods.
You could. That's an interesting point. When this method right here is called, it doesn't actually create a table. This tells EF to generate SQL in order to create a table.
Oh, okay.
And so that is a very important distinction. Like this is defining the script. This isn't actually defining like execute this code procedurally. So this is just, it's a little language that EF uses to sort of represent a migration.
Okay.
And it's abstracted away from the specific database. Like you can see traces of, oh, you're using SQLite, we're going to throw in an auto increment there. But in general, like whether you're using MySQL, Postgres, SQL Server, all the migrations kind of use the same language here.
Got it. Okay. Cool. That makes sense. And it knew that the ID to auto increment, that was the thing, just magic, EF magic? Pure
EF magic. Yeah. So there is, you could type every little thing about your model saying, this is the primary key. And I want to use this database type. EF has just a ton of conventions. By default, it will look for an integer, or I don't even think it has to be an integer. It just has to be a column named ID. And that will be your primary key. So if I wanted to call this key, suddenly EF wouldn't know what the primary key was, and you'd have to go and tell it.
Got it.
And so we call it sort of convention over configuration. You don't want to go configure everything. So we have these conventions. If you follow them, you can write less code. If you don't follow them, you can tell us what we don't know. Tell EF how to do it.
Cool.
Back to the anatomy of a migration. So underneath this little initial create with the up and down, there's this designer file. Sort of peel back the curtain, look behind and see what's here. You don't really need to know about this. All all of this is a snapshot of your model. And it's almost never used. It's just here in case when we're generating that SQL, we need additional information. We'll kind of look here. One cool example is on SQLite. You can't actually alter a column. They don't support that. And so one of the things we have to do is we have to rebuild the entire table, like recreate it in a new place, copy all the data over, and delete it, all just for a little alter column. And so the alter column clearly isn't enough to do all of that. So we'll actually peek back here and say, oh, okay, when we recreate this table, it's going to need all this additional information. This is like a last resort, though.
Gotcha.
As much as we can, we'll use the stuff that's right here.
Okay, cool. It's cool that it's there.
Yeah, yeah, just good to know it's there. Don't delete it. It might be used. The other thing we get is a model snapshot, and it's exactly the same thing. It is another snapshot of your model at this point in time. This one has a very different purpose. This is so that the next time you call add migration, we know where we're coming from. Because if you're just changing your apps model, like, we don't know.
Yeah.
All we have is an up and down method. And so this tells us, like, okay, create an up and down method for the changes between this snapshot. And then this, when you generate a new migration, this snapshot will be overwritten with the next current model and the next current model.
Got it. So kind of what you're saying is, like, this is the current snapshot in time, and then the migrations would build up all the changes that you made to it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Alrighty. So that's the anatomy of a migration. Like I said, I don't like that you can add a post without a title. That doesn't feel right to me. So I want to go back and I want to make that required. The good news is I haven't shared this migration with anyone. So I can just go and actually delete all this stuff. But again, like if you've added 2 migrations, you don't want to just delete the snapshot, because then we'll be completely lost.
Got it.
So there's another command to sort of keep all this stuff in sync. And it's remove migration.
So this is kind of, you're playing around with it, right? You're a developer. You're like, you think that you did it, but actually you didn't do it. So you're like, I messed up, roll back. I don't want to go into Git and undo everything, because you don't want to mess up all your code changes, basically.
Yeah. And I really like thinking about like version control in this context. Like, oh, I thought I was ready to commit my changes and push and send a PR. Whoops, I'm not quite ready. So let me go back and sort of amend that last commit in Git lingo.
Got it.
And so I'm going to undo this migration. I want to take this one away. I'm not ready to share this with anyone. It's not the way I want it to be. So remove migration just sort of removes the last migration.
Okay. So just like the last one in general.
Yeah. While keeping like the snapshot in sync and everything like that. Of course, it was my first one, so it just deleted it. But
yeah.
All right. So let's go and make that column actually required. I'm just going to use data annotations here because they're simple to understand.
And this is part of EF Core, or is this just
Yeah, this is part of EF Core.
Okay.
There's sort of 2 ways to do things. One is with these annotations. The other is to override on model creating. It's a lot more code, but some people really prefer that. And then you could say like model builder dot entity post this property. Oh, whoops, I forgot my parentheses. The property post. Wow. You can see it's a lot more code just to write. Really simple thing. And you say dot is required.
Oh wow, okay.
So if you really want to write it this way, you can. One of the reasons people don't like these annotations is that they kind of pollute your POCOs, right? It's not really a POCO anymore. It knows more about how it's persisted. Required is kind of, I think required doesn't really fit that definition, because your UI layer might use this for validation, you know?
Yeah, that's true.
So it's just a flavor. There is no right or wrong way. We just allow different ways of doing things.
Yeah, I've definitely seen people that are like, I really, really want my model to be in a separate, in a completely separate, library, and it should do nothing about anything. So that's cool that there are those 2 options.
Yeah. Let's add that one again. All right, and now we can see that the title column is not nullable. You must specify one of these.
Gotcha. And you needed to do it there. You couldn't just go in and change. You should really never change these files, basically. You should never, you shouldn't touch them.
I wouldn't say that.
Okay.
You may want to change these, but don't change them in a way that is out of sync with your entity framework model.
Okay.
You could say like, okay, now it's required in my domain model, but actually I want to allow some bad data in there,
Okay.
whatever. You want to relax some constraints. Like,
All right.
my application should never insert this data, but if some bulk update happens to import data without null, then maybe it does. I don't know.
All right.
But yeah, in general, you probably don't want to edit these. You may want to tweak them a little bit, but not in a way that disagrees with what you already wrote in your classes. That's kind of the definition of insanity. Your model's not sane.
Gotcha. Okay. Cool.
All right. So now I have this migration. It's the way I want it to be. So I'm going to go ahead and actually create my database now. I'm going to apply this migration to the database.
Okay.
And there's a simple command called update database. And if I do dash verbose, we're going to see a bit more output here, just so you can go, wow, if I can spell. All right. You can see a bit more of what's going on here.
And this is like creating it on your local machine?
Yeah, it's creating it actually right here in my
okay.
directory. In fact, let's look at the database here. So here I'm using the SQLite toolbox by Eric Jensen, a good friend of the EF team. It's just a simple way of inspecting SQLite databases. So here's the post table. Created an ID with a primary key. It's got a title column, not nullable. It's got a content. In here, there's this other little table. It has double underscore, so it's like special. Don't touch it.
Yeah, that's super special. Not just one underscore, but two underscores.
Two underscores, yeah. This is how EF keeps track of which migrations have been applied to the database. So again, like you're working in a team environment, you need to apply your teammates' migrations to your database. It needs to keep track of which ones. And if we actually look at this data, you can just see it has, there's that initial create. It's been applied.
Oh, cool.
You even keep track of what version you used to apply it.
Oh,
just
cool.
for fun.
Nice.
All right. So now when we run our app, everything should work because we have a database, has a schema. We can actually put data in the database. So let's go ahead and run it.
Got it. So there's nothing that you need to do. Like you don't need to call the migration because like in code, because you've executed it, so your database is up to date with the schema. Basically, it's executed those SQL commands to generate the tables.
Oh yeah. Let's go back to that verbose output. So see right here, you can see the create table posts.
Okay.
And so yeah, that update database command, what it does is it looks for the database. If it's not there, it will create the database if it can. It will see which migrations have been applied. It will generate the scripts for those migrations, the scripts being this create table right here, and then run those against the database.
Got it.
And so, yeah, this is very much like a developer time thing here, like a gesture. And we'll look at other ways of getting migrations applied. All right, so let's run our app and see if it actually works now and we don't get that exception. Did that work? Did it already run?
I think it already ran. I was like,
delete the database. Let's try all that again. It shouldn't actually have data in there. I'm kind of surprised. Maybe I kept one around on accident. Okay, update database. Now we'll run. All right, there we go. Adding sample data, and now I was supposed to run it, and it doesn't add the sample data, but it keeps those. Yeah, there we go. The second time I run it, it doesn't add the data and lists them there. All right, so we've got that. Let's look at making another change to the database here. And for this one, let's add an author. So each blog post should have an author here. All right, so now I've just changed my application code. And that's enough for Entity Framework to know what to do. So let's add another migration.
Okay.
We'll just call it add post author. And something descriptive to help me know what's going on here.
And I saw that it auto saved the file for you.
Yes, that's really the beauty of using the package manager console commands as opposed to the command line interface. It doesn't know anything about Visual Studio.
Got it.
You'll also notice it will pop up the file. It's little things like that that kind of make it more integrated, which is why I still prefer it. Here we go. We're just going to add a column, an author column to the post table, and it's text and non-nullable.
Cool. Yeah, and I see it just added it right below it. So kind of like the very first one, and then it just goes down below, right? Because date timestamp, basically.
Yeah, over here. Yeah, definitely. So again, I haven't applied this to my database, so let's do that. Just update database. It will look in the database, say, okay, I only need to apply this add post author migration. The other one's already been applied. And then if I refresh the database over here, it should have that author column. If I expand everything again, there it is.
Oh, cool.
And so that's a super simple overview of kind of the workflow of using migrations. Another interesting thing, like now that I've applied this, if I actually try to remove it, it will warn you and say, whoa, you've already applied this to the database. You need to think about this a little more. Because if you've shared this with your teammates, it's like rewriting Git history, right? If you do a force push, everyone's machine's going to be out of sync, and it's going to be really hard for you to get back. And so before you just sort of revert and change a migration, you need to stop and think about, has this migration been applied to other databases? If it has, don't remove it. Just add another migration on top of it so that everyone can keep rolling forward.
Got it. So in that case, would you then remove the author from your code and then run another migration? And then actually it would disappear, but everybody, it would be like, create it, add it, remove it, but then everyone's in sync, so it's okay.
Yeah, definitely.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, again, cool. that version control mentality is very key to me here. I think it really helps you use migrations correctly.
Now, I have a question for you, and maybe I'm jumping the gun here, but you have a database that's here in your source code, right? That you would check in magically into Git or not into Git. Maybe you would ignore that so everyone's running it, right? Well, what if that database doesn't exist? Like, it exists on a server. How does it know when you start up your app that you need to run migrations, or do I need to like VPN into a machine and run these commands in prod?
Yeah, and the answer, is it depends. Like think about mobile development, right? Like there are thousands of databases on everyone's phone. You can't just VPN and run. You can't just change. I hope you can't anyway. That would be a terrible. You can't just change their databases. You need to it needs to be part of like an upgrade experience, right? Like, oh, they've downloaded version 2 of my app. Their database is still at version 1. You need to roll it forward. And so in that case, where there's a phone accessing a local database, it's absolutely safe to right here, sort of during app start, to apply the migrations.
Oh.
db.database.migrate. I need to add a using here. Sorry. Here we go. And this does basically the same thing as that update database command, only when your app is running. It will find the local database. It will see which migrations need to be applied. If the database isn't there, it will create the database. And so this is super handy for client development. But if you think about this on a server where you scale out to 10 nodes all accessing the same database, they're going to be stepping over each other's feet. It's going to be kind of a nightmare. And so we really don't recommend this on like a server scenario, unless you have a single server accessing a single database.
Got it. That makes sense. Cool. All right. Oh, and then how would you, yeah.
And when you are in that server scenario, the one way we do recommend it is kind of the traditional way. You generate a SQL script, and there's a command for that too. It's just called script migration.
Oh, okay.
And this is like an artifact that you can then go and hand here your DBAs who know everything about databases. They can review it. They can say, oh, well, actually, you need an index here when you create this table. They can review it. This can become part of your deployment process.
Got it. That's really good. That's really nifty. There's all of these different commands built in, including like, here's the SQL script. That's really cool.
Yep.
Nice. Anything else you want to demo through or to cover?
No, I mean, no, I could go on forever about this stuff, but I don't want to overload viewers. This
I
is
think
really an introduction to how do I start using migrations. So.
I think this is great because I honestly, I feel like sometimes I can walk through the tutorial, but I'm not actually getting the sense of like exactly why or where, like where all these files are at. So to me, like this is absolutely perfect. And this on .NET episode, I'm going to rewatch like probably like 100 times. Basically, every time I create a new EF Core database and I'm using anything, I'm going to go through all this. So Brice, this is absolutely perfect in every regard. I love it.
I'm glad. And if you want to know more, are the docs.microsoft/ef. There's all kinds of great docs in there about, well, I want to use SQL Server and SQLite in the same application, or I'm working. What are some other tips you have for team environments? We have these things called bundles. What's a bundle? They were new in EF6. So all kinds of more information if you go and look at the docs. So.
That's awesome. And we will put links down in the show notes below, regardless of where you're at. If you're on Docs right now or you're on YouTube, go down there. I'm going to get all those cool, fancy extensions that Brice had as well, so everyone can install those if you're using Visual Studio. And of course, also the command line stuff too. Brice, thank you so much for coming on and walking through this. This is absolutely delightful.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in. If you have any questions at all about anything, but specifically probably EF Core and database migrations, leave them in the comments below. If you're over on YouTube, I'll have Brice go and check those out and comment back as well. And I'll check in on them too. And heck, if you're over on YouTube, don't forget to like this video and ring that notification bell and hit subscribe so you get notified whenever we put out new YouTube videos here. Brice, thanks again for coming on. Thanks everyone for tuning in and have a great day.